Mr. Harlem Désir, thank you for coming to our show, Sunday Analytical Programs.
And thank you for your invitation.
I will start by just reading your mandate here. The mandate states that representative freedom of media should be an eminent international personality with long-standing relevant experience from whom an impartial performance of the function would be expected. In the performance of his or her duty, the OSCE representative on freedom of media will be guided by his or her independent and objective assessment. So we had previously Dunya Mijatovic, who was a very outspoken critique of performance of government OSCE member states, and she was very critical, and when something was happening really, and she would not be silent. What is your intent?
Well, I intend to work on the acknowledgement of my predecessor, Dunya Mijatovic, and her predecessor, and to work on the basis of this mandate that you recall, which has been given to me and to my office by the 57 OSCE participating states. It's a strong mandate. I think the participating state can be proud of the commitment that they have took within the OSCE regarding human rights in general and freedom of expression and freedom of the media in particular. And they have had to this commitment the creation of a watchdog, of an office which is in charge of checking the respect of these commitments, and have a mandate also to act on the basis of early action mechanism anytime there is a breach in the freedom of the press, the freedom of the media, but also to bring assistance to the state, to the government, to promote, to ensure an improvement of the situation of the media.
So we know that OSCE itself, sometimes it's being criticized as being like talking shop, that it's not effective, that the decision-making process is questionable because there is a rule of consensus. If one of the member states is against the decision or resolution, then that resolution would not be adopted. So always there is one state that will be against any particular decision. So, and that's why OSCE, we see in many cases, the resolutions are being really discussed, talked about for a long time, and no action were being taken. And would that affect your impact? What is the impact on your job? Do you think this will, limit your abilities to?
Well, it's one of the rules of the organization that for most of its decisions, it's based on this principle of consensus. But while decisions are took, it means that all the states have agreed on the declaration or the principle. It's very important for the human dimension, for the human rights dimension. But there is a particularity of my office, of the institution of the representative on freedom of the media. It is that I have a mandate given by the state to act on the basis of my own analysis of a situation. I don't have to ask the authorization to any state to say that if a journalist is in prison, or if there is a risk for the safety of journalists, or if there is a risk for pluralism of the media, there is a need to change the policy or the action of a government. I can say it, and I can propose also modification in the policy of the participating state. So my institution within the organization has this very strong ability to act with a quite wide autonomous dimension.
And for example, journalists were harassed in Armenia during both in 2015 and 16 mass protests. And despite the fact that the prosecutor pressed the charges against people who were harassing journalists, who were who being violent against journalists. No charges were brought against. I mean, charges were brought, but they were not brought to justice. This is what's how you're going to deal with this situation.
Yes, we're still monitoring the situation. Safety of journalists is our first priority. And it cannot be accepted that even in a crisis time, with the demonstration, there is some attempt to the security of journalists, or that the safety is put at risk because of they just do their work. So my predecessor has many interventions regarding this case. We're still monitoring it because, as you recall, the inquiry is not finished. The prosecution is still ongoing, and we think it's very important to avoid any impunity regarding attacks against journalists or attempts to the safety of journalists. Any state of impunity will just be an incitation to other violence or attack on journalists. Of course, there is many participating states in which this issue is still very difficult. There is every year journalists who are beaten, who are harassed or even killed in the OSCE region while doing their work because they are leading inquiry on a very difficult case of corruption, for example. So this is for us the first call that we have to the state to lead real inquiry, independent inquiry, and to punish the responsible of attacks against journalists.
And how would you assess the media situation in Armenia? What's your take on Armenia?
Well, since I arrived in Yerevan for this visit, not my first visit to the country, but the first one in this capacity, I've met a lot of journalists, of media actors, of the public sector, the private sector, but also people in the government, in the authorities, the ombudsman, defender of rights. I think Armenia is a country where there is a very strong commitment to freedom of expression and freedom of the media. There is a very diverse and vibrant civil society and media, especially online media, which are like everywhere a new dimension of the press sphere. But anyway, we have discussed the issue of safety of journalists because of incident which arose during this attack against the police headquarters. We have raised the issue also of potential future reform of the law on access to information, where we will be very attentive to the fact that there is no backward regarding the current situation. We have discussed with the public broadcaster service about the issue of independence, which is very important. Also,
do you think public television is independent? What do you think?
Well, there is a regulator. Public service has its own advisory board, but as in any country, you know, you have to ensure that the editorial line is really decided by the journalists, and there is always political pressure. I think it exists like in every country, and it's very important, including in this time where there is this issue of fake news, where there is a challenge about the quality of information, to ensure that public service is a place where you can trust the quality of information, which is independent as a public service, which give the same voice to the government and the opposition. And there is rules, there is in the electoral law some provision on this, so we discuss it, and the people we have met have said that they are committed to respect this principle of public service.
I think Freedom House considers this media situation, I mean, they consider Armenia's media situation as not free. What do you think? Is it true?
Of course, we are always very attentive to Freedom House and other NGO classification and rating. We are not doing a rating. We are considering that everywhere there is a need to progress. Freedom of the media is a strong pillar of a democratic society. There has been tremendous changes in Armenia in the past years. The public service, which we discuss now, is itself transforming because of digitalization.
Are you talking about civic organizations, NGOs? You're talking about, when you say the public service, what do you mean?
I mean the public broadcaster service is changing. I think it has to go on in a transformation to become more and more independent. There is also other media, hopefully.
But you hear a lot of criticism from the NGOs, like civic society is very critical to public, even broadcasters, because they think that they're not independent. They are being influenced by the authorities, or
yes,
what's
yes, I think that public TV is not independent because of the pressure or the control.
But you see the progress there.
I think they are aware of the need to
reform.
Yes, to reform, to go on a transformation which has begun several years ago. I think even the situation of the public radio is not exactly the same as the situation of the television. Probably it's more easy for the radio. And I'm sure that the journalists in this public broadcast service want to play their role as independent journalists, and I think there is a need to ensure that the condition will be there for this independence.
But there's also the concern here is about mostly broadcasters, TV broadcasters. Which are, is the media ownership is not transparent. What do you think about that?
Yes, I think
the
that
private sector, I mean, you don't know who is who.
Yes, there's an issue of transparency regarding the ownership of private sector TV. There's an issue of diversity because of the advertisement market, which is a little one. And so it's difficult for many TV to develop. There is an issue of allowing new actors to be part of this TV landscape. All those issues, I think, have to be dealt with probably an evolution of the role of the regulator, which is there, which has a very important function, and which is also there to ensure that there is a real diversity, a good balance between private and public sector.
And the opposition is always complaining that they are not given the equal time in coverage in the primetime newscasts on television. Maybe during the election campaign, they have these, opportunity to go on TV and to advertise their programs, but as far as the broadcasts are concerned, like evening primetime news, they were not being covered as they wished to be. So, are you aware of that?
Yes.
The government is a large portion of that.
Yeah. As you recall, there is during the electoral period some very strict rules, and a respect of equality of time for opposition and majority. And yes, I think the next step should be to think about adding the same kind of rules even outside of the electoral period. I think for this it's very important to also use the OSCE with the diversity of the 57 participating states to try to exchange good practices. There is the role of EBU, which is a special body for coordinating public service broadcaster, but there is also the contributions that we could bring to ensure a more balanced access to public service for all political trends in the country, including outside of electoral period.
Now, you're talking about the safety of journalism. When you meet Armenian leaders, what do you say to them about this issue? For example, are you asking them to make sure that journalists are safe? And
regarding safety of journalists,
did you convey this message also to the Armenian leadership?
Absolutely.
Have you met them?
We will meet tonight. The Foreign Affairs Minister, and tomorrow the
President.
Justice Ministry, Minister.
Will you meet the president?
Not the president, not that time.
You will not meet?
No.
Okay.
As a member of government and the head of police also. And our main message is
you will meet also head of police.
Yes.
Okay.
So the message is two. The first one is that safety of journalists must be a priority for the government. It means that the instructions which are given to security forces must be very clear about the fact that there is a duty to protect journalists. And of course to avoid any kind of incident with journalists. The second is the fight against impunity. When there is an incident, as there has been, especially in July 2016 during this attack against
at least 3 of my journalists were harassed and we pushed away from the places that were covering the events, elections. So this was happening, and my cameras were broken, journalists were beaten. So these are the facts, and
that's unacceptable. And when it happens, there must be an inquiry, there must be punishment for those responsible at all the level of responsibility.
Mr. Désir, why I'm saying this, because despite the fact that you have issuing strong statements on these cases, but we see the same thing is happening again. So what are you going to do to prevent these things from happening? What's do you have any leverages, any tools to influence?
I think the fact to say this, and my predecessor, as you mentioned, it has published a very strong statement anytime it happens, is also a tool. It's a leverage, because government have two commitments. They have to respect those commitments. It's international treaty. It's enshrined in the Helsinki Final Act, in other OSCE declaration, and they recognize the fact that they are responsible for the implementation of this commitment regarding freedom of the media, safety of journalists. There is even other international texts that they support, like UN Security Council resolution on the safety of journalists. Second, we have a permanent dialogue with the state when it arises. We ask about the inquiry, we demand the result. So it's not just a statement, it's a permanent process, and we think that we have to convince government that also the credibility regarding their commitment is at stake when safety of journalists is not ensured.
Of course, Armenia is not your major concern, because there are a lot of other countries around. Yeah, I'm talking about, for example, our neighborhood, Turkey, Azerbaijan, Russia, and what you're going to say about these countries?
There's many journalists who are victims of harassment and restriction for exercising their profession in the OSCE region, and we have even a degradation of the situation in several states. There is more than 170 journalists in jail in the OSCE region, but most of them are in jail in one country, one specific country, which is Turkey. And there has been several trials of journalists in the past months, and we have been following this and asking for the release of these journalists. Some of them has been released. It also shows that the international action is important, and we are very much worrying about the trends, which is that because of security context and security challenges in different countries, there is an opposition which is put with the freedom of the media. I think we must not accept that. Of course, we have to take into account the fact that when there is a conflict, when there is terrorist risk, there is some measure which has to be taken by the authority, by the state. But ultimately, first, it does not justify to stop the journalists for doing their work, and preserving the freedom of the media and the freedom of expression is a factor of resilience of society confronted to security challenges. There is no strong society with weak media, with weak freedom of the media. That's the message that we are carrying towards the state, and we are working with all these different situation, but within the OSCE, to recall that freedom of expression and freedom of the media is considered as a contribution to security and to cooperation between the states.
Do you have anything to say about Semena, this journalist in Crimea that was constantly being harassed by the authorities there, being jailed, arrested, house arrested?
Yes, absolutely.
What
that's one of the cases.
You have to say about
absolutely.
it.
He has been arrested, put in house arrest. Now he has been convicted and is not allowed to follow his work. And that's something we are dealing with a specific situation, which is that there is the annexion of Crimea, which is not recognized in the OSCE, of course, and at the same time it is the Russian authority which has control of this territory.
Are you able to convey that?
Yes,
your
absolutely.
concern?
We ask for his free release, of course, but also for the right for him to go on his work and to express freely his view on the situation of his country. That's a major priority, and we also have support a process of dialogue between Union of Ukrainian and Russian journalists, which is very important in a context of conflict, where you have to fight against propaganda, fake news, and try to ensure that journalists can do their work even when their country are in conflict. Journalists are not in conflict. Journalists are not soldiers. They are not enemy, and it's very important to ensure that they will be allowed to go from a country to another, to report, and to just contribute to good information.
I have another question about Navalny. Despite the fact he's like a politician, but he's a blogger, right? He has his own blog on YouTube. You consider him as a journalist, and are you also looking into his situation or not?
Well, we look at whole situation, but it's right that it's more related to his activity as a political leader.
Yes.
And there is an office in charge of human rights and democratic institutions.
They are off.
Yes, it's the ODIHR within the OSCE. We work together, but here it's an issue which can be directly linked to the future electoral process in Russia. I don't know if he will be a candidate, but that's a possibility. And there will be monitoring by OSCE, ODIHR, the Office for Democratic Institution of Human Rights, of this electoral process, and that's my colleague who will look at this. But we will also look in this election to the fact that bloggers, media will be free to convey different messages without censorship.
And one last just question, and maybe I'm a journalist, and there are a lot of other Armenian journalists. What's your message to them? Just on your first
message to Armenian journalists is that I think they played a fundamental role in the construction of the democracy in Armenia. They have paid a heavy tribute even to this. Journalists has been aggressed, even killed in the past when it was the time to just construct a democratic Armenia. And I will be their partners in their action and project to develop a free media context and landscape in the country.
Thank you very much for coming to our show.
Thank you so much for your invitation.
And good luck.